There was once a time in this country's history where half of all college admissions were from students who were granted free education.
We are going to cancel all student debt in this country.
Can we not begin by welcoming God back in our schools?
You mean he can get any kind of education he wants? Now you're getting the idea.
The right to a good education.
The student debt crisis is one of the most dangerous and pressing issues facing the future of this country. It's a $1.7 trillion hole that 43 million Americans are directly affected by. But this is no longer a problem that affects just those who took out loans. So I encourage no matter who you are to pay attention to this video all the way through. Listen to the consequences, here are my solutions, and lastly, enjoy the video. Today, millennials are around the ages of 25 to 40. This is a crucial period in life where previous generations had begun to get better paying jobs out of college, save, purchase homes, get married, and start families. But for millennials, this is not at all the case. They currently hold just 5% of the total wealth in the country. Compare that to the baby boomer generation, which held 21% of the total wealth at the same age. So what is holding them back so far from accumulating wealth? We see that for many millennials, they're stuck paying off student loans, which has made them unable to save for a down payment on a home. Home ownership is the largest benchmark of wealth for middle-class families, and due to student loan debt, they're being robbed of that. If we take a look back at the chart, we see that baby boomers held 32% of the real estate in the US, while millennials at the same age own only 11%. A survey from the National Association of Realtors found that more than 80% of millennials with student loan debt who haven't bought a house blame it on their loans. Not only is student loan debt making it nearly impossible for many people to purchase a home, but it has also resulted in families holding off on having children. The National Center of Biotechnology information found that student loans delay fertility for women, particularly at very high levels of debt. While consumer loans or home mortgages immediately increase access to consumption goods, there is often a significant delay between the accrual and realization of benefits for student loans. Meaning that while most people with student loans will eventually see the benefit of their degree, they are often pushing off major life milestones later and later. Today we have seen fertility rates drop to an all-time low, which will inevitably cause a huge strain on younger generations to support a larger aging one. I think that a potential band-aid to this problem would actually relate a lot to my last video. Anyway, I think you get the point that when people are spending larger slices of their paycheck on debt every month, it makes it pretty hard to get your life going, and nearly impossible to spend much on consumer products. If you want to know what happens when you can't make a payment on your student loans, let me tell you, it is an absolute nightmare. If you're having trouble paying off your loans to the point where you fear you might not be able to make a payment, then you can contact your loan servicer and there are a few things they can offer to try and help. But be warned that none of these options are really appealing and are often completely unhelpful or will just put you in debt for longer. However, if you miss a payment on federal loans, that is a whole different story. After 3 months of not making a payment, the loan servicer will report it to the 3 main credit bureaus and it will show up on your credit report, which can majorly affect your credit score. After 9 months of not making a payment, your federal loans go into default. Here are a few notable consequences that the federal student aid site mentions. You may further affect your credit score, have tax refunds withheld, portions of your wage garnished, your social security retirement benefits could be at risk, bank accounts could be frozen, and you could be at risk for being sued by your loan servicer. Now, some of you might be thinking, 9 months? That seems like a reasonable amount of time to be able to make your payments. I can't imagine many people get to that point. In 2019, the US Department of Education reported that of the 43 million Americans with student loan debt, 20% of those borrowers had defaulted on their loans. That just shouldn't happen. This problem affects too many people. 70% of the students from class of 2019 graduated with student loans. It's horrible. It's not right, it's not fair, and I think something needs to change as soon as possible. Looking further into the data as to who is really defaulting on their loans, we see a strong racial disparity. Almost a third of black borrowers from the class of 2012 defaulted on their loans, compared to the 20% Latinos and 13% white borrowers. In fact, looking at all the data that accounts for race in student loan debt statistics, it's painfully obvious that black borrowers suffer at a disproportionate amount. I hope that if you didn't know before, you know now that this is a massive problem. A problem for everyone. A problem for the future. A problem that will only create more and more issues the longer we let this go on. So, where do we go from here?
One of President Biden's campaign promises was tackling the cost of higher education for Americans. He's indicated a willingness to forgive some $10,000 in student loans. Senate Democrats, including Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and Massachusetts Elizabeth Warren, are urging the president to go bigger. They want up to $50,000 per person forgiven.
I'm sure most, if not all of you, have heard about recent talks about student loan debt relief. Different politicians offer different amounts in relief, as well as different plans on how to pay for it. There are certainly some policies that resonate more with me than others, but ultimately, it's pretty unnecessary. This isn't really something that needs to be paid at all. For starters, a good chunk of that $1.7 trillion in debt is from interest, meaning money that wasn't even initially borrowed. As for the rest, it's already been paid. You know, it's not like the government owes anybody else. These institutions have already been paid out. And it's an education, something that can't really be rescinded, so unlike a house or a car, it's not an asset that can be seized by the government. The whole idea of student loans is so flawed to begin with. Listen to Elizabeth Shermer, author of Indentured Students, explain.
Giving a student loan is a terrible financial product. I'm going to give you a loan for something that I cannot repossess. And if I could repossess it, I can't sell it to anyone else. And if I took it away from you, you wouldn't have the credentials to compete for work to paying me back. But the whole darn thing was modeled off the original New Deal housing program, as if a mortgage is the same as a loan, and the same racial and gender inequities wrapped up in that original federal mortgage program are bound up and have always been in student lending and federal tuition assistance.
I have more to say about why we shouldn't worry too much about the price of something like this, but I'll get more into that near the end of the video. While I think student debt relief is ultimately a good policy, it's not enough. Don't get me wrong, I understand for a lot of people in this country, $10,000 to $15,000 in student loan debt relief would go a very long way. But for millions of others, it wouldn't even make a difference. The government should be rewarding people for wanting to continue their education and create a better future for themselves and their families while simultaneously strengthening the American labor pool. If someone wants to further their education, I believe it's their right to be able to have the total freedom to do just that. And not only that, but it's in the government's best interest to do so. And that's why I think that free tuition should be granted to all Americans. Student debt cancellation is a massive step in the right direction, but it doesn't tackle this issue at the root of the problem. To do that, several policies would need to be set in place. We would need free tuition, as well as education reform, and finally be able to ensure fair wages, and not just among jobs that require a degree, but all jobs, including jobs that require skilled training. I understand to a lot of you, the idea of total student loan debt forgiveness sounds a little radical, and the idea of free tuition is completely out of the question, but it really shouldn't be, because we've done it before. In 1944, nearing the end of World War II, the Department of Labor feared that the returning 15 million veterans would mean 15 million unemployed people returning home. Economists at the time were certain that this would create a major post-war depression. To combat this, President FDR signed the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, otherwise known as the GI Bill. The GI Bill was a law that gave World War II veterans a series of benefits that included a year of unemployment pay, guarantees for loans to purchase homes, farms, or businesses, as well as a free higher education. The effect was that half of all college admissions in 1947 were veterans, and the GI Bill would go on to fund the education of 22,000 dentists, 67,000 doctors, 91,000 scientists, 238,000 teachers, 240,000 accountants, and 450,000 engineers, as well as 3 Supreme Court justices, 3 presidents, 12 senators, 14 Nobel Prize winners, and 24 Pulitzer Prize winners. So the investment clearly paid off in terms of traditional societal impact. But what was the economic impact? The GI Bill would expire in 1956 and would have cost billions in taxpayer money. But these newly educated people would be able to earn higher wages with their degrees and were able to stimulate the economy by buying homes and spending more disposable income than they would have ever before. The GI Bill recipients generated an extra $35.6 billion over 35 years and an extra $12.8 billion in tax revenue, resulting in a return of $6.90 for every dollar spent. So, what happened? How do we go from being ranked first in the world for college graduates in the post-World War II era to just 10th today? How do we go from schools being extremely affordable for middle-class families to colleges asking for $20,000 to $50,000 on average for tuition alone? And how did we let the total student loan debt reach a whopping $1.7 trillion? Prior to 1980, student loan debt was virtually non-existent. The California public school system was even completely free up until 1985, and the government was continuously increasing the budget for education. That was until the Reagan administration. Reagan's new budget proposed a $44 billion reduction, or rather a 5.7% decrease in everything besides defense. A good chunk of these budget cuts would come at the cost of public universities. Although this phenomenon certainly started under Reagan, I don't want you to walk away thinking this was all his fault. The price of college has gone up nearly 6 times in just 35 years for all 4-year institutions, while average student loan debt has risen from $22,000 to $36,000 since 2007, and the total student loan debt has doubled in the past decade alone. It is a consistent lack of state funding for these institutions that have created the problem we see today. I normally like to refrain from comparing the US to other countries when doing these videos, simply because it's too easy to say, look how well this works in another country, it could work here too. Just as easy as it is for someone else to say, well, look how horrible it worked over here. But in this instance, we have 8 other countries of comparable development to the US that figured out a way to grant free tuition to their citizens. Not only do these countries have free tuition, but some of them managed to do so and rank higher than the US in education all across the board. One consistent example is Finland. Their education system receives praise globally for their emphasis on hands-on learning, lack of standardized tests, and their prioritization of apprenticeship and experience over memorization. Their teachers are highly valued, making 102% the salary of the average college graduate. In the US, this number is just 65%. You may say that all these things are subjective and don't necessarily mean that they have a better education system. Fine. We can look at something a little bit more objective. For example, Finland ranks higher than us on the Program for International Student Assessment. This is an exam to compare the math, science, and reading skills of all OECD nations in order to rank their education systems. In 2018, Finland ranked top 10, while we ranked just 25th. And this was actually a significant improvement for us compared to 2015. So we have an example of how this worked in our own country's history, and now we have examples of how this works today in several comparable countries. Counterpoints. One point that I hear brought up all the time from conservatives is that more people need to understand their own financial situation and seriously consider vocational school. Well, I certainly agree with the second part. What I didn't say earlier about the GI Bill was that not only did it fund college, but it also funded the technical and vocational school of 3.5 million veterans. And if we go back to the Finland example, 43% of their high school students go to vocational schools. I think it will take time, but it could be seriously important to let people know that college really isn't the only option. Not everyone will even find fulfillment in going to college, so basically forcing them to go is just silly. However, both college and vocational school should be an option for every American. Your parents' financial status shouldn't have to severely limit your career path like it does for so many people today. So what happens if everyone is able to get a degree? What will happen to the demand for high-skilled jobs? Who works the other middle and low-skilled jobs? Once again, I think the answer relates a lot to my last video. Immigrants want to go to countries that have a place for them in society, and bringing in immigrants means filling out the labor pool more evenly, as well as creating a greater demand for different consumer goods, ultimately creating more jobs at every tier of skilled labor. What about the fact that tons of people don't even finish their degree, which in a system of free tuition would be wasting a ton of money and resources paid for by the government? This is a totally valid concern, but a degree is not the only reason why college is so important. People learn critical thinking skills in college. For a lot of people, it would be their only way to explore and get a chance to escape their hometown and learn more about other places and people and open their minds a bit more. And I think it's this fact that scares a lot of people in power. It's a time of growth for a lot of people, and I think that if someone wants the opportunity to go to college, they should have that opportunity without having to worry about being in debt the rest of their life. A lot of you probably want to know about all those useless degrees that the government will now be funding.
Paying for kids who are getting degrees in gender studies and poetry and philosophy. Of course that plays poorly with the American public, and that's why it's remarkable that Joe Biden could win an election. The only reason that he would be able to is because the media never talks about this, because he doesn't speak the language of the middle class. He hasn't seen Scranton. Also, he didn't win the election.
I think that looking at a massive program like student debt cancellation or universal free tuition and focusing on something like that is so incredibly unproductive, because this same program would be funding the person who has all the work ethic and capabilities to be a surgeon or scientist or a lawyer or maybe president, who would otherwise never be able to afford it. But hey, what's so bad about getting a gender studies degree anyway, Steven? What about even if you go on to finish your degree? The fact is, many people don't end up using it directly out of college. For starters, I would like to just reiterate the point I've already made, that a degree is not the only beneficial part of going to college. I think the real answer to this question comes from separate policies. Ideally, we would need to be able to first ensure fair wages in this country for all jobs, and I think this largely would come from more unionization, but really that's a whole separate video. The other part to all this is reforming education in this country. I wish we would adopt an education system that values application rather than memorization, and also mentorships rather than studying for tests. I think these steps help prepare people for a career rather than our current system, which is to do whatever it takes to pass a few classes in order to get a piece of paper at the end. Most of these concerns would have you thinking that it's just conservatives that have issues with a policy like this, and that might be true for the most part, but liberals have an issue with the fact that student debt cancellation would largely go to help the elite of this country. I honestly have no idea where that comes from. If anything, this would work to produce results that promote equality in several aspects, considering women and black people own a disproportionate amount of the debt. Women owe 2/3 of the total student loan debt, and on average, after 20 years, white people have paid back 94% of their loans. After that same amount of time, black people still owe 95% of their loans. And to be honest, I don't really care if the government is paying for the children of Jeff Bezos or whatever to go to college. My stance is that education should be a right to everyone, so making it universal is the most fair, simple, and effective way to do just that. So what happens if we don't fix this? Well, it's just a continuation of all the things that we already see. People go further into debt, rates of fertility will continue to fall, some will have their credit ruined for decades, people won't be able to buy homes, our labor pool grows weaker, and we could face an economic disaster that this country hasn't seen in nearly a century. If I haven't gotten you on my side, at least for the student loan cancellation part, I don't know what will. If you can recognize all the suffering that could happen as a result and still think nothing should be done, I have no words. Actually, let me introduce you to someone who has an interesting take on suffering.
But that moment is special because there's value in suffering. And in today's society, we have convinced ourselves that there is no value in suffering, that the entire role of, say, government is to end your suffering. But this is a false promise. Not only is it a false promise, but it will create a weak society that is unable to sustain itself. That's a really important point, and I think there's deep truth in that.
You heard that right. Dan Crenshaw, representative of Texas' most gerrymandered congressional district, thinks that a lack of suffering creates a weak society. I gotta say, I always thought that an uneducated society that doesn't have access to basic necessities like healthcare was what breeds a weak society. But maybe Dan is right here. Maybe it's in the government's best interest to try and maximize suffering. That would surely create a very strong and tough society. If you don't know who Dan Crenshaw is, you might be thinking I'm taking this short clip out of context, but I promise you I'm not. I encourage you to watch the rest of the podcast to see just how out of touch some of these people in Congress really are. But again, this is not just the Republicans who are obstructing immediate student loan debt relief. There has recently been a bit of a debate whether something like this can be done through executive order.
People think that the President of the United States has the power for debt forgiveness. He does not. He can postpone, he can delay, but he does not have that power. That has to be an act of Congress.
So with all this good, all President Biden has to do is flick his pen, sign it. Make America a happier, better, more prosperous place.
So not only has Biden already canceled student loan debt twice, for a relatively small number of borrowers, but he's not even the first president to exercise this power. Back in 2019, Pence made a speech saying President Trump directed the Department of Education to eliminate every last penny of student debt owed by a permanently disabled veteran. With the stroke of a pen, the president wiped out $750 million owed by more than 25,000 heroes. Now, the rollout of that relief did not go quite as planned, but nonetheless, the fact is that this is well within the power of the executive branch. The American Prospect found that 95% of the total student loan debt could be canceled through what's called Compromise and Settlement Authority, which was given to the Department of Education through the Higher Education Act of 1965. It gives them the power to compromise, waive, or release any right to collect on student debt. Executive order is important due to the urgency of this issue and the fact that 56% of Americans are in favor of total student debt cancellation. And I want to conclude with this. Ultimately, free education would be an investment in the future of the American labor force. There's a famous quote that goes, "Education is an important element in the struggle for human rights. It is the means to help our children and our people rediscover their identity and thereby increase their self-respect. Education is our passport to the future. For tomorrow belongs only to the people who prepare for it today." I just want us to be prepared for tomorrow. And I hope you do too. Thanks. Cut that part, I don't know. too libtardy.